You're listening to Making Data Simple, where we make the world of data effortless, relevant, and yes, even fun.
Welcome back to the Making Data Simple podcast. This is where we make data simple, or at least we try to. By the end of the day, I think we talk about everything under the sun just because we can. Until I get kicked off here, I guess that's what we're going to continue to do. So welcome. Today, our topic is designing for analytics. My guest is Brian O'Neill. Hi, Brian. How you doing, man?
Great, man. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Brian is the product designer, and he's a founder of the topic today, which is designing for analytics. I've got a lot of information in front of me, but I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself, if you wouldn't mind, Brian, and let the folks know who you are.
Sure. Well, you pretty much covered it there. I have a company called Designing for Analytics, and I'm a designer and user experience consultant, and I'm really focused on the design and UX for custom enterprise data products and internal applications as well, since not all software is necessarily commercial.
So is this like if we get a fence and there were two sides of it, being designing and the other side's analytics, are you more on the designing part, or are you more on the analytics part, or do you feel like you sit smack dab on the top of that fence?
Well, I guess I don't see it as two opposing things on the side of a fence. So typically the software applications I'm working on have analytics in them, and most of the time they're decision support tools, or they could be like a subscription information product. And typically the problems there are, one of the biggest ones is going to be that customers aren't seeing the value of our data. So if it's a product, they're seeing like it's hard to sell, but we know we have this great stuff, and yet people can't understand it. And it's usually after they've built a bunch of stuff and gotten a prototype out, and then they're kind of realizing everyone else, those pesky humans, are not seeing the value of what they've created. And that's often where the design problem comes in. And it may or may not be problems with visualization. It could be experience. Most of the time, it goes beyond just what I would call ink problems on the screen. On the other side of that would be internal tools, right? So companies that are not necessarily tech companies putting out a commercial software product, but they might be doing something new for the first time, not using just a set of vendor tools, but they're trying to build an internal data product, and they're seeing low engagement with it, or they're seeing it's difficult to get people to change the way they've done things in the past. And a lot of times that tends to be technology driven. So when we start rolling code and we start doing big architecture projects and things like that, but we don't really know what the outcome is that we want. So we focus on creating assets and outputs and less on creating outcomes. And it's either really easy to say that it was successful because it's so broad and vague when you say stuff like digital transformation for our shipping, department. Well, that's great. So you can pretty much do anything with some software and say that you met that goal, right? Or you can get really concrete and say, something that has we're going to optimize the time from, lift and sort to pack by 10% by introducing blah, 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 or something like that, where there's actually a way to go out and test the outcome and not necessarily have the solution built into the objective. Like, we're going to use AI to change our business. It's like, well, maybe AI is the right tool. Maybe machine learning is the right tool. And I understand, every business, the boards are all saying, you need to be using machine learning. What are we doing? What is our AI strategy and all this kind of stuff? That's great, but ultimately there needs to be there's probably a desired outcome, right? And so you want to make sure that you're putting those tools in service of the people that are going to use them.
Great. I have got a ton of questions around all that, but that's okay. I'm going to hold on. I want to make sure I finish a proper introduction, and I took a few notes so I can ask those questions. But I know
Sure.
You've worked with several companies, and you've helped lead them to the promised land. You got any reference customers that you want to mention here?
I can't say some of them. I've done a lot of work with IT companies, both in the hardware side, so storage and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those systems come with onboard software management tools, and then related startups and companies in that space. that are also putting out. I'd say that was kind of, I guess, my birth into this particular area of design was working in the storage domain in the data center, and that's a place where analytics and data are really critical to effectively almost everything comes down to keeping the business running, because most people, like right now, we're using Cisco WebEx meetings to record this, right? Well, somewhere there's an application manager whose job it is to basically make sure that this tool is like oxygen. It just works. We don't think about the uptime of the Cisco WebEx meeting application. We have no idea it's running somewhere in the cloud. And so it's like oxygen. And when that stuff goes down, it's a problem. And so when it does go down, analytics are what's used to help troubleshoot those situations, because the data center is a very complex place. So that's kind of like where I got started was in that. I have worked at NetApp before and some other companies in that space. I've done a lot of work with SaaS information product companies such as Apptopia is a startup here in Boston. So they provide app analytics for mobile application publishers. So, for example, if you're say you're a game developer, you're typically game developers are going to be really interested in what their competition is doing, what countries they're operating in, where are they ranking in the App Store, what languages are they using, what SDKs are they using. It's competitive intelligence. So I've worked on their first product, and they're doing quite well. I've done some work in the patent and legal space with the patent collaboration tool, which was an internal tool for a company called Elysium Digital. And so their goal was to basically turn the process of doing patent research, which often you'll have a whole team of legal experts, both lawyers and scientists and forensics experts looking at patents and prior art and things like this. And that industry was still working kind of like with everyone has a PDF with comments written in hand in the margins. And so the collective wisdom of the firm was much harder to see. So they wanted to create a tool to basically ingest the publicly available patents, make them searchable, and make them actually commentable, kind of like a Google Docs for patents. And then there were some analytics on top of that kind of got into visualizing the claim trees and looking at text analytics to understand the content of these things and kind of how unique the different patents were and things like this. So that was really about, and their goal effectively was, we want to spend more time, and this is important, right? The goal was not to build a piece of software to go make it easy to do that. I mean, ultimately, yes, we want that, but really what it was about is we want to spend more time doing important thought leadership research on the patents and talking to our clients about that, and not on what we broadly might call, or Jared Spool would call, tool time, right? Which is the process of like getting all the PDFs together. Maybe one person writes out everyone's notes in the columns. It's like, oh wait, everyone's talking about sentence 3 and claim number 24. Instead of spending all that time trying to understand the wisdom, they're spending more time now on the strategy behind the patents themselves.
All right, so let's dive into a few questions then.
Sure.
I was intrigued by a couple of your comments and your references. By the way, it looks like you work with anything from a startup to an enterprise client, at least from what I can see in some of the information I have on you. And then, to be fair, I hope I can say this, that you've done a lot of consulting. It hopped around a little bit, but it sounds like you might have found your home in the current role that you're in. And a passion, the same passion that I have, I guess, is around data, the client experience leadership, which essentially leads into analytics. In fact, I feel like I'm kind of selfish. I always say that I've got those 3 passions, but I think the cool thing about it today is, while I'm in a role, my role at IBM is all about data. It's like everybody has to have those 3 core tenets to their business today. So I'm kind of selfishly, my passions are matching where the world's headed. I feel like, I don't know if you feel the same way, but it seems like you're in the same area and the same mindset. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I started out, I had full-time roles as a designer at several companies, both startup Lycos way back in the day, and then I went into financial services at Fidelity and JP Morgan and E-Trade, and I ran a design for a startup, a social networking startup for a while. But I ultimately found consulting was kind of the thing I like to do, and I had been consulting and moonlighting on the side on top of that for 20 years, and so about, I don't know, 14, 15 years ago, I went just fully independent, and I've been really enjoying that. Partially because I've seen what it's like in internal, especially the kind of the larger the company that you go, it's really hard to drive certain kinds of changes that need to be done. And it's kind of sad, but a lot of companies need to bring in an outside expert in order to move things along sometimes. And it may be that the company already has that internal wisdom. It just unfortunately may be coming from a voice that doesn't have the ability to move it forward. And so you help move those things forward. And sometimes that's what it is. Other times it's coming in with a totally varied skill set that's not necessary. Like, for example, like one thing that sometimes is challenging for my clients is with my expertise, and is that I'm learning new domains all the time, which I actually really enjoy, but I knew very little about patents and prior art and just that whole domain lingo. And then now I'm in storage and I'm talking about IOPS and queue depth and like application response time and latency and like that whole world. And so, but one thing that's kind of interesting is I think as you pick up those new domains, they get easier to pick up new domains because you start to see patterns in the tool usages and what the software needs to do. And it's funny how sometimes just the outcomes that need to happen, if you can't boil them down to some pretty simple sentences, there's something usually just wrong already right there. It shouldn't be so difficult to explain what the software is supposed to achieve when it's built.
Well, here's my question in terms of what you provided, and this is a good liaison, and I want to make sure I understood this correctly. You talked about creating assets versus outcomes. Did I get that correct?
Correct.
Can you clarify that distinction? And I'll give you some, while you're thinking of your answer, maybe you already know it, but the confusing part to me is I get what you're saying, but I do find, and no offense to any of the listeners out there, that, and you made examples of this where, leaders are, a lot of places that I go, a lot of clients I visit are talking about, hey, we're going to use AI to change our business, to transform our business. Things that are somewhat nebulous in terms of meaningful, measured, outcomes. My point is, I don't know how you're able to do the creating assets. What I find is a lot of times you got to help with those outcomes as well. This is why I've talked on this podcast before about the maturity curve and figuring out where clients are with the maturity curve so I can understand where they want to get to and then help them with those outcomes. But you say, again, back to where I started the question, you're creating assets versus outcomes. How are you able to do that? Because I find and you even said it yourself, a lot of these clients don't have the outcomes, amazing as that might be, to work back from. How are you doing it then?
So I'm not saying that there won't be any assets. I'm saying it's easier to just go and start creating assets that may not result in business or user outcomes that are desired. And so when the focus is on jumping to implementation without a clear strategy and without really understanding what the outcome is.
In my case, then, you're saying the same thing. You got to start with the outcomes and work backwards.
Exactly. And
I see.
As you know, it's easier and easier. There's open source software. There's so many tools, the APIs. It's so much easier now, right, to get from nothing to something running in a browser window. You've got an application going in a week. There's something to look at and click through, right? But
then
it actually achieve what you want?
Yeah. Agree. Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree, because I think, and I do a lot of speeches, and I think you do as well, around the path, at least the ladder to AI. Because I think, AI has more than just, it's more than just verbiage. I think it is very important in machine learning because we've got so much data. The only way, you can't manually go through this data anymore. I mean, the size of the data is such that you're going to have help, and that's where machine learning and AI comes in. But to your point, and I can't reiterate this enough, everybody wants to skip to step 10 when you've got to have, the most important steps are 1 through 5. And it seems like that's where your focus is, to not only help with the outcomes, but then step back and say, all right, now I'm going to talk about designing for analytics, get you through the first steps, and then help you achieve said goal.
Correct. It's essentially, I think we're talking about the same thing. It's having an idea of the strategy, and specifically being able to quantify what a success looks like for a particular application or a service. It also means going out and actually evaluating it, right? So one thing I talk to my clients about, right, is designing on assumption and designing on fact. So and this gets down to clients risk tolerance, right? How comfortable are they with jumping in and feeling like, hey, I really know my space. I know what my customer needs. I don't really want to spend a lot of time doing research and all this kind of stuff. And usually they think research means, oh, it's this huge survey and it's going to take all this time and blah, blah, blah. That's not what I'm actually talking about. But you can jump in to design on assumption, which is, I think I know what everybody needs. And sometimes that's okay. It's not always wrong. It's just, are you comfortable with whatever technical debt you're probably going to bring in to phase 2 and the time that it may take to undo some of that? B, are you really going to be willing to undo those technical choices, and maybe you entered into a vendor contract or whatever it may be? Are you okay? Are you going to be willing to, change that if you find out that whatever you built isn't actually working for the people that need it?
I would actually be an advocate for designing by assumption. I mean, I think you can go places that you never thought you were going to head and hopefully answer questions that you never thought of yet. But I think your point is spot on. Most of the clients that I work with don't have the appetite for the cost that goes into an assumption that turns out false. Right? In fact, I think they don't have the cost. I mean, a lot of people want to go straight into AI, which, look, models have been around since, even the late 50s. I mean, 70s, there was a lot of models that were being developed. The thing now is that the decrease in price of storage and compute have made these models so much more valuable, and the data is at such a rate that we got to use machine learning and AI to get there. But, and I can't stress again this enough, and I probably reiterate this here and in previous podcasts, the problem is the intended cost is always on the AI side, and I'm just going to create these models. But the unintended cost, which is, being a data guy is still, troubling to me, because I see this as the real breadth of it, and that's creating the foundation based on that data, making sure it's cleansed, you got a good corpus of data, it's governed, etc. I guess what I'm trying to say in a long-winded comment is that the intended expense is just on AI, but then you find that you've got to do a lot of work to make those models right.
Sure.
So to your point, designing by assumption, which I think would be very welcome, I don't think a lot of clients have the appetite for today, because that's also there's a lot of costs that go into that. There might be a high return, but a lot of cost up front.
Yeah, and that's something because I deal with this with my own clients about, especially when you get down to startups and smaller companies, right? They often don't want to spend any time doing, and what I'm talking about a lot of times is like, let me interview 5 prospects, 5 current customers, 5 people that are using your competitor's tool that you're trying to jump into that space. Let me go spend some time with them and teach you how to spend time with them and how to do qualitative research to inform this first thing. What we're actually doing is we're trying to validate the problem space. Like, you think that there's a problem here or there's an opportunity. That's probably correct. But if you don't really know how to fit this application into their world, then again, you can do all that work, clean the data pipeline up, right? As you see, 80% of the AI thing is still like, oh, it's data engineering and cleaning up stuff. 20% is doing the model work, and then there's getting it in production, and then the data scientist wipes his hands and says, hey, I did what I was asked to do. The model's working there. I'm happy to tweak it. If it changes, let me know. They have no idea maybe they don't know the line worker that's actually using the simple interface that was supposed to be created to create that change downstream, right? And so if no one's looking at that big picture and understanding what that success looks like, then it's like, yeah, you spent a lot of money on stuff and you designed on assumption. Maybe you got that first hit right. Maybe the fruit was so low hanging. It's like, man, even our grade C effort here is still better than nothing. And I'm not saying never do any design, never do any product development, or even an experiment with machine learning or any of these other technologies without having any user research up front. And some of the UX people in that community will say, oh, you have to go do all this stuff. No, you don't. It's just understanding your risk tolerance, right? Are we willing to make a pivot if we need to? What are the costs in time and tools and people and all that if we're wrong? And if the upfront cost is not huge, then by golly, yeah, go out and make an educated guess, put something out there, and then use that real software to go test. Like, go evaluate the software with real people. It's even better if you can test with working code. I mean, I'm always an advocate of that, but I think you can also learn a lot with a small investment in design up front. paper prototyping and things like this, and design mock-ups, you can learn a lot and save a lot of money downstream. And most of the time, engineers, at least in my experience, the engineers and the product development people I work with, they love having an idea of the design up front.
I think the interesting thing that you've said to me here is that your approach, I have to say, is in some sense, even from an enterprise client like IBM, we use a very similar approach when we're working with clients, and that is, we go to the client, and I'm working with an enterprise client right now, and I'll take out all the peripheral steps, but just in summary, going in, getting their ultimate objective and that outcome that we talked about, which is not bad, fairly good. We put it down on paper, and then we've got an exercise where we're interviewing their teams. So we go in and interview different parts of their teams, give an outside-in view, and ultimately that's intended to come back and make sure those outcomes are exactly what they think they should be, or how we can stretch the boundaries to even answer more questions that we didn't even know existed.
Right.
And on top of that, usually in adjacent to that, I should say, we'll usually pick one of the top problems that they have today, and we'll skip some steps and develop a model for that top problem just to show what machine learning and AI can do with that problem. And in terms of doing so, then when we put it a little bit into practice, you can find out where they truly are in the maturity curve, and then use all that information to reset that outcome, and then come up with a revised strategy slash approach to what I would call, again, I'm overusing the term, but the ladder to AI, everything from data, governance, analytics, machine learning, etc.
One of the things I liked, and that I would encourage product managers and leaders of these internal tools, whoever, I call them data product managers, whether or not you're selling a product. I think there's a role called the data product manager that's important for people working in like a non-technology company developing internal software. It's that person sitting at that intersection of understanding the data, understanding the business needs, understanding the users and the consumers of the software, and kind of that hub and spoke, right? They are that key hub, whether they have the title of product manager or not. But anyhow, my point was, whoever that person is, and especially them, one of the values of doing some type of low-level qualitative research up front is getting to what you said, and that's learning the stuff that you never knew to ask about, because you only know your own world space and what's been, maybe it's been, complaints have been reported to you and you've been logging like, oh, we're hearing all this stuff about whatever X department, it's time to go give them some love with a new application. But you only know what's been reported, and that qualitative research of going out and interviewing the people in the last mile that are going to use the service, I love that, and I love that when my clients and the people I work with learn something that they just never knew. It's like, man, I had no idea. I just assumed this guy was sitting at a desk, and he's actually on his phone, and he's in the car, and he's in sales, and he needs the CRM, this whatever. He needs to know when to call his next sales lead, like in mobile format, and we've been like screwing around with this desktop thing the whole time, and he's never even on his computer, like whatever it may be. That's a kind of a silly example, but the point is that learning about what you never knew to ask about, that comes through the process of kind of like this conversation we're having right now. This is not a survey. You're not surveying me with question number 9. We're letting it go places, and we learn things there, and that's a really important thing to do if you really want to nail good software for people and get the user experience right.
Well, where we are today, I mean, I think the IT has to be integrated with business. And I can tell you usually I can tell right off the bat if I go visit a client, and if I'm in the meeting and I've got both sides at that meeting, they don't have to pull somebody in ad hoc, that they've got it, and they mean business. You may have the CTO, the CDO, and other people on the business side as well, because they get that they got to break down the traditional roles and boundaries to be able to do what really needs to be done, and to use all the data at their disposal. Hey, let me step back for a second. I know I asked you this at the beginning, but here's the reason I asked the question. And I said, like, on what side of the fence you are versus design versus analytics. Now, I get fundamentally designing for analytics could mean, hey, you're doing a similar role that I do in terms of designing for analytics. But the difference, I think, in what you bring to the table is that you've got a history of true UX and design experience in your background. So when I say design, and tell me if I'm wrong, I mean, but the reason I asked that question is because you were really focused on, design, fundamental design. At least that's the way I understood it in terms of, where your history is. Is that true? I mean, and how do you implement that into, quote unquote, designing for analytics?
So let's talk about design for a second, right? And sometimes to my my mailing list, we talk about this sometimes, which is what I call capital D design and lowercase d design. And so by capital D design, sometimes it's called design thinking. I'm not a huge fan of that word, but I endorse the processes that go into that. But it's looking at the entire experience, and I think still just talking about lowercase d design when it's thrown out. Some people think about architectural design, like it's designing the technology plan. That's technically a form of design as well. I'm talking about the user experience piece, which is inclusive of user interface design, right? What we call data visualization a lot of times in the analytics space. It can include that as well, but it's really that holistic user experience. It's helping customers understand the specific problem, like making the problems concrete, clear, and actionable, and then helping them look at, hey, is the user experience a problem with why this is not happening? Like if you've already taken a stab at it, 2 stabs, 3 stabs, you're seeing low adoption, you're seeing low user engagement. If you're a SaaS, maybe you're seeing customer attrition. You have a feel that, as we talked about earlier, maybe customers they don't think the data is so valuable, yet your whole business is staked on this like amazing IP that you have, and you want to share that with them as a subscription. What is going on there? So my goal is to see, is this a user experience thing, and is there a way better design can help you achieve these kinds of goals? Sometimes it's low-level usability issues, right? Man, I love this tool, but I just don't have, a week, the last week of every month to go in and run this report and then go do this other thing. It's like, why is it so hard? And when I close the browser, it forgets where I was and I have to start over. It's stuff like that, So it can be user interface. It can be kind of the broad user experience strategy. But that's what I'm talking about when I talk about design, and my interest being in analytics products and analytics applications, specifically, custom ones for the enterprise. So.
So it lends myself again back to that question. That's exactly. By the way, I was going to ask you about. I know you do this lowercase d, uppercase d thing, so I was going to ask you about that. You explained that well. That's great. But in terms of user experience design, I presume that's around the glass, the console, the visualization that you really put a focus on in terms of driving analytics in a simple, right up my alley, a simple method or simple way.
That's correct, and I think so. Let me give you another example of what I consider to be design, and that's, think about time and workflows, and like if you think about a workflow example, right, like customer life cycle. So one phase of design that's often missed. This is getting much better, by the way, but it's the onboarding experience, right? We've all seen that with mobile applications, and there's different ways of, some people force you through a tour, and other places have little, occasional pop-ups. It's like, hey, this is the first time you're using messaging. Here's how it works, and then they dismiss the whatever. And so there's your kind of onboarding experience, right? That's part of what I'm talking about as well. And then there's also this phase that I call the honeymoon period, which is that time past the initial setup. Perhaps like in an analytics application, it may be like, hey, we're still gathering data from all your data sources, nothing to see here. Type your email in and we'll send you an alert when, we've done the first collect and we actually have something to report back. Oh, that's cool. I don't need to keep checking this freaking URL every week to see if my data is ready. It'll just ping me. That's nice. So I stick my email in there. And then what is that experience like in the first 2 weeks? Maybe you're doing some kind of predictive analytics thing where it's supposed to be able to give me next month's projection, but maybe it's going to take 4 months of data in order to give a reasonable projection out.
Well, look, you don't have to convince. I'm with you on the design thing. The fact that we instrument design and being, driving a development organization, there's what I like to term a love-hate relationship, because we're always pushing them, they're pushing us, but that's exactly the way you'd want it to be. And a lot of times we're waiting on design, which I get frustrated with, but you got to get that right. Mm-hmm. The user experience is paramount, particularly in the world of annuity and subscription. where people vote with their money. So I got
Right.
that. So let me ask you a question. Do you spend like 80% of your time on that piece? I mean, is that your specialty, or do you still, do you do the data engineering with clients? Do you do all the above? Do you do the data science
No.
with clients?
No,
Okay.
not at all. My focus is really on helping the business align customer objectives with business objectives and making that clear, and then getting, my engagement may remain at the strategy place. We may go into some level of implementation, but I'm tending to do less design implementation. So I'm talking about creating mock-ups and assets. So sometimes I might work on paper prototypes or something in low fidelity, and then they can go work with a contractor or their staff team to actually start to go somewhere. But it's that nothing to something phase of the design, which is where a lot of places that maybe are on a tight time crunch, or they need it to be right or better the first cut and not the third cut, where they'll come to me for my expertise there. Sometimes I am going into higher fidelity if they may want to hire me to actually take it to a higher degree of fidelity, but I'm definitely not working on the data side and the technology implementation. I'm not a data scientist. That's not my background is in music. I'm also a professional musician, and so my experience is much more with people than it is with tech.
By the way, I'm going to get back to that musician piece before we go. I knew that, and but we went straight into some of the role here, so I'll come back to that. So who's your perfect customer then? To simplify all that, I mean, if somebody's listening out there and they say, if they're trying to figure out, hey, where's my lead in here? I mean, I don't know if Brian's right for me or not. I mean, what's the perfect customer, the perfect situation that you say, look, you give me this, I get you a solution?
Sure. So typically, if it's like a tech company or something like that, it's usually going to be somebody in product management. But if it's an engineering product or an engineering service, a lot of times they don't have a traditional product management group. Sometimes it's called product marketing, and they're really like engineers that went into the marketing line. They don't use product management as a term as much, but effectively that's sort of their role, except they're much more focused on the marketing side of it. If it's an internal tool, it can be different. It can often be someone from engineering where, again, typically when you say, hey, the business says let's build an application for this patent stuff like that I was talking to you about, right? Well, actually, most of their forensics guys all have computer science backgrounds, and that company particularly like to write their own applications and do a lot of internal custom work. So it was someone with a PhD in computer science and engineering, who was a manager of an engineering group because the business went to them and said, build us a tool, right? They don't have a designer. They don't have a concept of a product manager because that's not what their core business is.
With that, I think that's a good mic drop statement. So with that, we only got a few minutes left. So what I wanted to do, Brian, is get people to know a little bit more about you. It's what I call a lightning round. I rip through it. Although I got one question, and then I'll ask you just some random questions that I think people find interesting. At least I find interesting in it, so that's how we'll do it. But I know you're a musician by training. In fact, I know you've done some professional in Boston, and I know you've even been at Carnegie Hall. How do you go from there? And tell us just a little bit about that, and then how do you end up in designing for analytics?
Yeah. So yes, my background's in music. I started out in piano and went into percussion in junior high school, and eventually I majored in percussion studies. And when I moved to Boston about 1999, about 20 years ago, it was really to focus on kind of these two areas I was interested in, design and performing. And so I've been doing both of those since I moved here. And when I went into consulting, it was partially to have a good balance and facilitate the touring and stuff that I'm doing that doesn't necessarily take place in the evenings where, I'll be starting a show. I'm playing Hairspray, the musical, coming up. Actually tomorrow I load in for that, and then playing down in Providence, another musical, a new Disney musical that's coming out, and playing with Portland Symphony next weekend as well. So I've found with the consulting, it helps me balance the two careers that I have, and I love having experience of kind of two different worlds. It keeps me fresh, just my perspectives both on music and also on technology.
The cool thing about that is they're diametrically kind of opposed. I don't want to say that because I think they integrate with one another, but the cool thing is you get a fresh perspective from two different sides of your brain, I think, with those two passions.
Yes, yeah. It's hard sometimes because you want to see each world. You want to see some of the other world. It's like, man, like this is some of the music and the art stuff. You're like, geez, it's like, wow, look at the ticketing system for this thing. It's like you just like start looking at analytics, and I'm thinking about like, wow, what the fill percent needs to be on this hall for this show to be profitable. These multi-million-dollar Broadway touring shows.
Sometimes you need that outside in thinking, so I think that's good. I think it's really good.
So yeah, so.
All right, so here I got like 1 minute questions that I just want to hit you. You just give the first thing that comes to mind, and if there's something that you don't answer, we can pass and move on. What is the most wonderful company culture you've witnessed?
Wow. Okay, yeah, I in recent memory, I think I can answer that. From a client perspective?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, anything goes here, but go ahead.
So the most collegial work environment I ever saw was probably one of my clients, which is called Elysium Digital, and it was actually that company that did the patent work. They had the most kind of congealed team environment where the respect of everyone that was working there, it was kind of unbelievable how it was very decentralized kind of feel to the organization. And there was definitely an energy there when I would come in and do work there that I could feel even as an outsider kind of early on. Maybe because half the people there are musicians. I actually met the managing director there is actually an amateur percussionist, quite good actually here in Boston, and we met through music actually. And several of the people there were also musicians as well. But for a bunch of computer scientists, good players, but very good company culture, I really enjoyed that.
Number one role model today.
Wow.
It's got to be somebody.
This is going to sound really corny, but I really look up to my wife. I just got married in May, and my wife was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, and she's really that story of $50, one suitcase, and she now has a doctorate in music, and she's got an active studio here and teaching and performing, and her drive and her willingness to take the punches and the things that come with that whole life, like just kind of seeing that real thing when you're with it instead of, you kind of hear about it, right? The American story. But now I live with her experiences, and I don't know, I count I'm aware of the blessings in my life, and I don't know, I kind of look up to her. And
all right, well then I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Who's the better musician?
Who's the better musician? Who's the best musician? Between the two of us.
Yes.
Well, me, of course. No.
Oh, boy.
No,
you
she has
the doctorate.
She has the doctorate in flute. I only have my bachelor's in music and percussion. But, yeah, we have kind of different lives. She's in class. She's very heavy into classical. I still do some classical work, but I do a lot of music and world music and shows and other things like that. So we don't look at it like that. And we've actually toured together and played together. We met on a gig, so nice. That's always fun.
All right, fantastic. Brian O'Neill from Designing for Analytics. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate the conversation, and we'll put some information in the show notes, and then we're also, I think we got your website there, so we should be good. You good? Do we nail it?
I think we nailed it, and thanks for having me on, and thanks for talking about making data simple as well.
Fantastic.
I'm all right with you there. So.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for listening to the Making Data Simple podcast, where we make data fun. Be sure to visit IBMBigDataHub.com/podcast to access the show notes and uncover even more great episodes. Remember, the views expressed here are those of the host and its guests, and do not necessarily represent the views of IBM. Until next time, over and out.